Hello, my name is John Hurst, and welcome to the third webinar in a four-session webinar series about creating innovation frameworks within your organization. We'll be going through kind of what the last few have been about, but today's is specifically about the concept of risk tolerance in innovation. And because we're approaching this from a faith perspective, we'll also be talking about how that fits in with the kingdom and with our faith and with being part of many of us faith-based organizations. And so that'll all be part of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'd like to define innovation for you. I've used this definition several times, but it's always good to remind ourselves, right, and remember what definition we're using. I love this definition by Richard Lyons. Innovation is fresh thinking that creates value. So the question really is, what kind of thinking are you doing that is fresh, that is new, that is different? And can you draw a straight line from that new thinking, that fresh thinking, to value that you're generating for the kingdom, for your organization, for the outcomes that you're trying to accomplish? That's really what we're about here in this webinar series. We're trying to say, how can we generate fresh thinking that creates value for the kingdom? And then the other definition that I also enjoy is that second one by Scott Birkin, which is innovation is significant positive change. What I like about that one is that it specifically talks about the size of the change. It's significant. Innovation is not a small thing usually. Innovation is a big change in your organization, in your practices, your programs. And it's also a positive change. Innovation isn't creating something that's worse, it's creating something that is better. So that's an important dynamic and component as well. And we're talking about innovation within the context of frameworks. A framework is a basic structure, underlying system, concept, or text. Right? We are saying, how do we apply innovation as a framework within our organizations? And the point here is that we are trying to create innovation that will last within the nonprofit sector. So many of the innovative works that have been done were instances within projects or programs isolated and not really having or taking hold within the broader organization. So that's another key element that we're dealing with and working through. So I'd like to just remind us of where we've been and where we're going. We use this analogy of the train to describe the framework that we're working on. The tracks represent how we get and help our staff and stakeholders understand what we're doing and become part of what we're doing. The engine is the DNA, the values, and the vision that drive the innovation. The cart with all the wood in it is the lifelong learning. That's right. It's the fuel that fuels innovation. We're learning. We're curious. We're growing. And today is the cargo, right? We're talking about risk tolerance. It's the thing on the train that can explode, right? It's the risky thing. It's the thing that has to be managed or understood or worked with properly. And in that, we're going to talk about a theology of failure as well as how to understand and discuss and interact with risk. And then the next webinar, which will be on November 12th at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, so mark your calendars if you're available, is best practices. So it'll be just simply some helpful tools and tips to help you implement innovation within your organization. And as always, these videos will be available so that you can show them to others, review them later, etc. Well, I think as we begin this process of talking about risk tolerance, we have to think about why innovation is risky. Innovation is risky because it requires us to engage the unknown. Just like that guy standing on the edge, right? There's a moment where we're standing there and we don't know what's in front of us. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know where it will go, what it will do, how it will be. And that is the moment where we're involved in innovation. Because innovation is treading new ground. It's doing new things. So we don't know how it's going to turn out. And when we're working with the unknown, we increase the likelihood of failure dramatically. Thus, we're increasing the likelihood of risk. And the question becomes, in the face of the unknown, when your possibility of failure is high, when the risks you're taking are high, how will we handle those things, especially in the kingdom? What does it look like to handle those things. And that is what we're really going to be discussing this morning. Very simply, I want to focus on two things today. We're going to first focus on the concept of a theology of risk, how we understand risk in the kingdom, how we understand risk from a biblical perspective. And then from there, we're going to just focus on really 2 to 3 tools to help you manage or understand or work with risk within your organization. I use that word manage, but I hesitate to use it for some reasons that'll become clear as we kind of walk through this time. So we're walking into the unknown, but the challenge for nonprofits is walking into the unknown is not our natural posture. It's not what we do naturally or easily. See, people of faith, our focus is kind of goes in two directions. Part of what we're doing is calling people back to their roots. If we're working within a context of a Christian culture that has been Christian for a long time, we're saying, hey, come back to this thing that you might have known when you were a kid, or when, or that might have been more common in another time in our country. So part of us is calling people back to something, and part of us is telling people about something they haven't heard of yet. But that thing that we're telling them about, even though it's new to them, like someone in another country that has never gotten to hear the gospel, right? Even though that idea is new, and so there's a lot of innovation that tends to happen around how we will tell people about the gospel and that message. The faith itself is not new to us, right? We have something that is stable, that we look back over the history of the church and of the Bible and of all that God has given us. We say we are trying to stay true to something. We're trying to protect and guard orthodoxy. We're trying to help people understand something that we believe already exists. Well, in that environment, when we believe it already exists and we're trying to guard it and protect it, that is naturally an environment where we do not want to take risks. We are very risk adverse in those environments because our desire is not to change the message, right? Our desire is not to change the help, the transformation. Our desire is to stay true to that message, stay true to the transformation that we want to see in people. And when that is the case, fundamentally, we do not want to change. It's hard to change. And that is the case for much of the nonprofit world that we work in. And that's why innovation is so challenging and why this issue of risk becomes such a huge one. So why does preservation reign? Why do we want to preserve? Well, I think it's because we have a broken theology of risk. We really believe that failure equals a lack of faith, a lack of God's blessing, a lack of God's provision. And what I want to talk to you about today and share with you is that I don't believe that's true. And I believe we have to switch our thinking. We have to change our thinking about failure if we are going to innovate for the kingdom. We also want to preserve things because we want to be successful. And we have these models of success, right? We have these ideas of what success is. And so we say, if we stay true to those, then we will be accepted, then we'll be valued, then we'll be affirmed. Donors will give, board members will want to be on the board, partners overseas will want to work with us. All of these things kind of keep us from innovating. And finally, innovation and risk-taking requires a lot of grace and forgiveness and mercy in the process. And we don't get a lot of that in nonprofit sector. When we mess up, it's made very aware. We're made very aware of that mess up, that failure, and we're reminded of it over and over again. Oh, you're not a trustworthy organization. You didn't follow through the way we thought you were going to. It can ding us in so many ways, and so with that lack of grace, it also makes us very, very hesitant to want to innovate and take risks. One of the passages that really jumped out at me as I was thinking through a theology of risk is Psalm 73. I encourage you to read it. We're not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to overview it very quickly. But essentially what happens is in the first verse or two, the psalmist says, And I'm going to read from verse 2 here. He says, "But as for me, I almost lost my footing. My feet were slipping, and I was almost gone." This person who is the psalmist, they essentially are having a crisis. They are seeing that around them, all the wicked people, all the people that are not following God are being successful. They're seeing the results they're hoping to see. And they're seeing that they, as the follower of God, are struggling, aren't making it. And so the next about 16 verses, they kind of outline this and say, the people, the wicked people are seeing this and they're doing this, and this is all the success they're seeing. And then in verse 17, it kind of makes a switch. The psalmist says, "Then I went into your sanctuary, O God, and I finally understood the destiny of the wicked." So here's a moment the psalmist is saying, God, what is going on? Why is it that it works so well for them and it doesn't work for me? Why are they successful and I'm a failure? And then, as the psalmist is wrestling with this with God, he goes into the sanctuary of God. And at that moment, he realizes that all the things that looked like success for those wicked people, those worldly people that were doing things for a certain reason in certain ways to advance their own agendas, those were not going to ultimately be successful. And it changed his whole perspective. And then finally, in verse 26, as you see on the screen, it says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, so I might look like a failure. But God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." So he comes to a point where he realizes that God defines success, and obedience to that definition is what leads us into something that we can consider successful in the kingdom, even if it looks like failure all around us. Now, it's one thing to say that, right? We've all heard that. This is not new information. We've wrestled with it. We say that the success in the world is not success in the kingdom. But I think we need to dive in a little deeper to really have an understanding of failure within the kingdom. Father John Navone is one of the foremost thinkers on this in the Catholic Church. He really has done a ton of writing on the theology of failure and what that is. And I love this quote. He says, "The risen Christ is the answer of God to human failure. It is the hope, joy, and consolation for the billions of little nobodies whom the successful and powerful of this world deem to be total failures." That's God's standard for success, and that God's standards for success of success and failure are not ours. What I think he's pointing at here is that the ultimate example that Jesus or that God gave us of how to understand success was his son. His son came, lived on this earth, accomplished certain things, but in the eyes of the world, ultimately failed. And then was risen and ultimately succeeded in bringing in a kingdom that will then go on to change the world and make it what God wanted it to be. In this story of the rising of Jesus, his ministry, his impact, his influence, what seems like his failure, and then his rising in the resurrection, we get this picture of what failure means in the kingdom and what success means in the kingdom. And I think that by looking at the life of Jesus as kind of at the core of our theology of failure, we begin to understand a little bit more of what God is saying here, what he wants from us. And we're going to dive into that here. I love this quote by J.R. Briggs. "Failure is a beautiful gift wrapped in an ugly package. With a redemptive view, it is an opportunity to experience grace in new expressions and on new levels." Okay, and here is, I think, the core of what I've realized has to be in our theology of failure within the kingdom. The world, if you Google failure, you'll receive millions of motivational articles and quotes and encouragements. And all of them are essentially saying that failure is a means to an end. It's okay to fail, But the goal is to keep persevering, to keep trying, to do it a different way, to learn. And the goal is still to have worldly success. So we have normalized failure as a part of a process. But that fundamentally is not what the kingdom is talking about. Failure is not a step on the journey to earthly success. Failure redefines success as glorifying God, meaning that if God wants me to do something that ultimately ends up in failure, it is not a failure if in doing it, I gave glory to God and I honored God in the process of accomplishing it. So if I do something with all of my heart and I do it unto the Lord and I do it to bring him glory, if it fails, that does not change how God views it. That simply says that it did not have the outcome I hoped it would have. What it doesn't say is that it had a negative outcome in the kingdom. Because God is going to use that thing. If I was truly obedient and truly trying to glorify God, there is no way that that will not be part of the success story that is my life as a servant of Christ. Do you see how that dramatically changes how we think and how we view failure? It's not a means to an end. It's not a step in the journey. It is an act that actually allows us to learn and grow, become more like Christ, and give him glory. The difference is a nuance there, but it's when you think and pray and process it, it really makes a big difference. The other nuance in a theology of failure that I think is really critical is this blogger, William Lane Craig. He had a very helpful phrase. He said, there's a difference between failure in the Christian life and failure in the life of a Christian. Okay, so failure in the Christian life means that I, as a Christian, am going along and I choose a way other than God's way in a certain situation, essentially sin. That could be anything, right? It could be pride. It could be any sort of sin that might come up in my life. But that sort of failure is fundamentally different than failure in the life of a Christian, which is situational. So, for instance, something might happen to you that is very situational, that is not because you did any particular thing, but it is because of the situation in your life, etc. It looks like a failure. It is a failure in the sense that it did not turn out like you or others expected. But that fundamentally is different. Now, in neither of these situations, are you any less a believer? Are you any less loved? Are you any less able to recover and go on to do all that God wants you to do, even though there may be consequences in both situations? But each one needs to be addressed a little differently. And by understanding the nuance, we say, so is this an issue where I have sinned and I have lacked obedience and I need to reestablish that relationship with Christ and then continue moving forward? Or is this a situation where something has acted in on me and caused what I was doing not to work? And I have to persevere through that. Those situations are fundamentally a little different. And we need to think about those differently as we think about failure within the kingdom. Finally, we're going to pivot to risk here. And what I want to do is we're going to take questions on this first section in about 2 minutes once I'm done sharing a few of these thoughts from Tim Keller. So be preparing a few of your questions or your thoughts, and we're going to go through those, and then we're going to switch over to some of the practical ideas and thoughts to help you work on understanding and utilizing, essentially engaging with risk within your organization. So Tim Keller has an excellent, about 20-minute devotional on risk, and I'll be sending you the link in the follow-up email. It's just a short video. He did it for a conference of entrepreneurs, so it was very much in line with innovation and the kind of things we're talking about here. And I really appreciate a few of his points. So I'm just going to summarize a few points from him, and know these are coming from his video. So number one, he said that risk really began to be socialized within the Western world in the 1600s with the entry of capitalism. And that makes sense, right? Before we really had an understanding of assets and managing assets for profit, in a system-wide way. Obviously, that's existed since the beginning of time in one way or another. But capitalism as a system created the need to manage these assets and minimize the risk that would happen to these. At the very same time, in the 16 and 1700s, deism was on the rise. Deism is the idea that God exists, but he's like a watchmaker, a clockmaker who sets the clock and then lets it go. And so, what Tim was saying, which I really appreciated, was he said, as capitalism was rising and as we were learning about assets and risk and profit and management, at the same time, a huge portion of the entrepreneurs and the business leaders and the thought leaders of the day were accepting this idea of God that said, God created everything, but he's really leaving it up to me. It's my job to manage it. And so there was this divide between God's creation and who God was and God's sovereignty over that creation. And so Tim went on to say that really in the Bible, while it doesn't talk a lot about risk, fundamentally at the basis of risk is this idea of fear and control. And I think that that is one of the key elements of how we understand and design a theology of failure. How do we understand fear? And how do we understand our need for control? When are we afraid? And when do we respond with control? So I want you to think and pray about that as you process this time. You know, where is fear creeping into your life as you look at your organization, your work, your innovation opportunities? And when are you responding with a desire to control things instead of letting God control things? And take a minute to look up those two verses. He does a great job espousing on them, sharing about them. All right, we'd like to leave a minute for some questions on the theology of failure and the idea of failure in the kingdom. And I'll start with this first one from Greg. How do we practically maintain a balance between presumption and risk within a biblical framework of faith? You know, I think this is a key question, Greg, that I think gets to this next slide a little bit, and it's this word management. Um, to manage something is to affirm our sense of control over that situation. To acknowledge something is to understand the risk and to affirm the potential sacrifice if it does not go as we want. I think that the way to balance these two things that you're asking about is really to say, God, what do you want me to acknowledge? So I'm not presuming. I'm acknowledging that I'm about to take a risk that is going to have potential consequences. It will require sacrifice on my part. It may require sacrifice on other people's parts. I need to understand that. I need to act accordingly and sympathetically to those around me that will be affected. But I'm not going to try to manage that risk. I'm going to acknowledge it and surrender it. And this, there's a part, and in Tim's video, he talks about this. There's absolutely a role for us to organize and facilitate and work with resources and do our part. We have to be proactive. So we don't just simply say, God, it's up to you. I'm just going to sit back and let you figure it out. Because there is this process of God giving us things to steward. And stewarding requires us to work with those things. The question that I think we have to wrestle with is, when is working with the assets that God has given us become a control thing for us? And it's going to be different for every person. Someone will be able to design it and structure it and still fully trust God. Other people, the minute they start designing and structuring, they're really saying it's mine and God, I don't need you anymore. And they're in a different place. And so I think we have to essentially ask God, where are we in balancing those two things? Another question? Love to interact a little bit more before we move on. All right. I think someone's writing a question, so we'll wait just one more second, and then if not, we will move on. I'll also be sending you, when I send you the email, I'll be sending you an article by Father John Navone, or maybe an interview with him that I thought was very, very helpful. So I'll be sending you that as well for you to review. Um, Very insightful. I really appreciated his thinking, um, and want to make sure that you guys get some visibility with him. Of course, in some of our circles and more in the evangelical space, we may not have heard about him quite as often. All right. Well, I see some people typing, and we'll come back, circle back around to some more questions, but we need to keep moving here. All right. So now we want to talk about risk, right? Um, Failure and risk are a little different. Failure is when it falls apart, right? Risk, I love this quote by Bruce Brunsma from Envoy. He says, risk is measured by the distance between the best thing that can happen and the worst thing. I thought that was a fascinating description because every one of us can imagine what is the best scenario possible out there, right? You can imagine what that is. And then you can, of course, imagine what's the worst scenario possible, right? And risk is what will happen if, when I'm shooting for the best, I hit the worst or somewhere in between, right? What does that look like? So I think that's a very helpful way to think about the gradation because there's levels of risk, right? Risk is not just one thing. At a more simple definition from Merriam-Webster, risk is the possibility of loss or injury. So when there's a possibility that something could go wrong. And then risk tolerance, which is the concept that we're kind of focusing on this webinar, is most prevalently understood as a measure of one's financial ability to withstand losses. So usually risk tolerance is used within a financial and a financial industry setting, right? They're saying your risk tolerance is how much can you handle losing, right? And that's your risk tolerance. In our world of nonprofits, we're not mostly necessarily talking about how much money. It could be money, but it could also be reputation, it could be staff, it could be lots of different um, resources that we might question how much of it could we withstand to lose, right? So I want you to think for a minute about some of the resources that you have, that you are in charge of stewarding for the kingdom, whatever they might be: people, money, time, partnerships, relationships, reputation. And just think for a minute, how would I measure how much I could withstand to lose in that area? And that's just a sense for what your risk tolerance is. Some people, and we'll talk about this in a minute, some people really feel like they can't lose anything, right? It has to stay the way it is. Those people are very unlikely to do any innovation because there really is no ability on their part to lose from what they are doing presently. Other people have a tremendous capacity to withstand a loss, right? They say, I'm willing to risk a lot here. And those people are more likely to be able to innovate because they say, I'll put that resource on the line in order to try something new, to gain a greater reward. And those people have more flexibility in how they design some of those things. Again, everyone's going to be at a different place. No one on this call is at the same spot. Um, so why is it important for us to understand risk? Well, risk fundamentally is key to organizational decision making. One of the things that I have realized working with nonprofits for over 20 years is that some of the key reasons why nonprofits were unsuccessful in innovating was because there were different risk tolerance levels from key stakeholders within the organization. And the executive team, the CEO, et cetera, the board chair, did not understand the differences. And when they did not understand the differences, they took decisions, they moved forward with things, and they could not get the buy-in, they could not get the momentum um, to really engage with us at a deeper level. So first of all, the board and management relationship require clear assessment for reality-centered decision-making, meaning that if there's not a crystal clear understanding of what level we're willing to risk as an organization between the board and their CEO under a policy governance model or Carver model, um, the CEO is always going to struggle. And the board is always going to struggle because the board is either going to feel the CEO is not pushing hard enough, or the CEO is going to feel like the board is not allowing them to push hard enough, or some variation in the middle. But that's not the only relationship. The staff and stakeholder communication needs to recognize risk. One of the things we realized, and we talked about this in our first webinar, when we talked about donors and stakeholders, is that sometimes the staff or the CEO or the board of an organization can be willing to take on great risk, but other key stakeholders like donors, like major donors especially, or even individual smaller donors, may not be at the point where they feel ready for the organization to do that. And when the organization takes that great risk, the organization can be in jeopardy of losing that funding. And so it's really, really critical that there be a discussion around this. And my main focus today in this webinar is to give you some tools to have that discussion. Um, underneath underneath having the discussion is very, very much customized. So we're not going to go way down into the weeds here. But I'm going to give you some tools that allow you to have that discussion. The first tool is some risk profiles. Okay, I can guarantee that in your organization you probably have all 4 of these profiles. Um, the first profile is the risk avoider, right? We have some people within our organizations that if they come up to a risky situation, it stops them in the tracks. They will not move forward with the project, with the initiative, with the line of inquiry, with the experiment, if there's any risk at all. And if you have a person like that in a high level of leadership, that essentially makes innovation very, very difficult unless it happens in a little corner of the organization where that person isn't directly involved in significant ways. These people who are risk avoiders can really be in all parts of the organization, right? So you could have them on the board, you could have them on the staff, in the field, in the home office, in the C-suite, all over the place, right? These aren't designated to certain parts of the organization. The second profile is the risk manager. And this is a person who actually loves to get in there and assess and analyze the resource and figure out if we tried this, how much risk would it be, and is that worth it? And they love to analyze the situation and manage it. Those people are wonderful to have on your team as long as they have a kingdom perspective in their management, right? In their stewardship of it. If they have a very professionalized and secularized understanding of management, they tend to desire way more control than the kingdom would allow them to have. That's an easy way to put it. And so risk managers, especially when they come from the for-profit world and they get dumped into the nonprofit sector and just go to town with their role, sometimes they desire a whole lot more management of that risk than is healthy for the nonprofit, especially in a kingdom context. So that's something for us to consider. These roles, especially, and I would say, when you're hiring operational people from the secular world into your nonprofit, especially if it's a kingdom nonprofit, you need to have a frank discussion about risk management with them. Understand their perspective, understand how they view it. See if you're aligned, because I've seen so many instances of a very well-meaning person who's aligned faith-wise generally, but in this area has a very different perspective. And it causes significant challenges and ultimately causes the organization to struggle to move forward. The third profile is the risk user. This is a fairly typical one within the nonprofit sector because it's all about passive aggressive behavior. Essentially, there's a whole set of people, especially in nonprofits, but probably in for-profits as well, that take a risk and see it as a tool to influence people and programs to their ends. So they see a risk, let's say it's a security risk, or let's say it's a risk of losing donors, and that risk produces fear, and that risk produces uncertainty. And that risk is a tool that a whole set of people can use to move forward their agenda to retain power, retain control, retain influence. Sometimes it's being done very innocently, meaning they don't really understand what they're doing. Other times it's being done very overtly and very much in a desire to control, manage, and manipulate. But this is a profile that we have to be aware of because it really has a huge impact on your ability to be an innovator. And finally, it's the risk flaunter. And you know how we talked about risk organizations in nonprofit space being very risk adverse, and that tends to be true overall. But especially in pioneer ministry, we have some people who are very risky, and I would say they flaunt the risk factors and essentially dismiss them. Now, a lot of times they're doing that because they're saying, I trust God so much that I'm not going to even worry about that risk. Many times their motives are just fine and they're truly having that level of faith. Sometimes they just love adventure, right? And they love to flaunt the risk and just go for it and try it and figure it out. And, there may be bodies in the wake, or they may be injured in the wake, but that's all part of the adventure. And I think there may be other profiles, but these are the four that really stood out to me. And I would really like you to do a little assessment, especially of your leadership team and of your board. Maybe some key global leaders within your organization or key programmatic leaders, and kind of get a sense for what kind of risk profile are they? And how does that color how they respond when someone brings an innovative new idea? I think we need to be fairly transparent with each other about our profile and say, hey, I'm an avoider. That's just who I am. I want to do what's right for the organization. I want to move us forward. Help me to overcome my avoidance, right? That sort of thing. So that's something I think that we need to name it and then work with it in order to see the greatest reward from our innovation work. I see that Johan has a question related to the slides, and I'll get to your other question, the other question from Dean later. But just very quickly, just to put your mind at ease, this entire session is being recorded, and the video will be available for you to review, as well as the slides will be put on my slide deck profile. I'll be sending you a link to that as well. So you'll have full access to these materials later for your further review. All right. Okay. So one of the things that's extremely helpful to do at the management level, this isn't so much a board role, we'll talk about the board in a moment, at the management level is to create a little risk tolerance scale or matrix, right? This is more of a scale in this case. All I've done here is simply say, what if there were 4 risk levels, low to high, and we defined those, right? So you created a definition so that it was clear what was level 1, what was level 2. Then when we're looking at different scenarios for innovation, for response to situational opportunities, etc., you're able to say, what level of risk do we believe this is? And then people are able to understand the level of risk and then wrestle with the sacrifice that might be required if it fails, if it does not go as we plan. Remember, if it falls between total failure and total success, somewhere in there, if it falls more towards total failure, though, you'll have already wrestled with the implications of that as a team. It's not that you don't go ahead and do it. You may still do a very risky thing, but having a scale of some kind with some good, solid, clear definitions allows you to be very, very clear about it and to be clear with each other. Because what I've seen happen a lot of times is that you'll have a leader who assesses something at a level 1, but of course doesn't say anything because they don't have words for this. And they present the idea and the team assesses it at a level 3. and their response is appropriately dramatic based on it being a level 3, and the leader says, what's the problem? This is a level 1. This is no big deal. We can handle this. But there's no vocabulary to talk about that. I think that's a huge, huge challenge. Okay, let's talk a little bit about governance, because I think this is a really key thing, and then we're going to go into actually writing some risk statements that I think will help you as an organization. My recommendation to you is that just like if you have a policy board or carbon model board, so you govern by policies, right? You focus on the ends and let management focus on the means. If you have that kind of board, I believe that you really need a risk tolerance policy. And essentially, that first bullet point is what is a policy from board source. It's helpful to just remember what we're talking about, right? But essentially, what the policy should focus on is saying, based on our outcomes, based on our ends that we're trying to accomplish, that the board is responsible to hold the CEO accountable for. Here are some of the levels of risk tolerance that we have, that we feel comfortable with. Here's how we view risk. Here's how we would monitor risk with president, like levels associated with outcomes. Do we want to be communicated when something's a 3 or higher on risk scale? Does the board need to be aware of what's going on? Maybe not approval, maybe awareness or something. But there needs to be a policy that kind of just explains, here is kind of how we see risk, here's the comfort level we have, and here's how we'd like to interact with management about that risk. You've already got policies about, situations related to, the executive limitations around how much can the CEO spend without getting board approval. You don't want to rehash those. This is not a policy to rehash what's in your executive limitations. This is simply for the board to communicate to the executive and to each other how they understand risk and how the CEO should communicate to the board about risk. So that's something for you to be thinking about. I would highly recommend that you consider adding a policy like this to your board policy manual. The second thing I'd encourage you to do is to write some risk statements. Now, these statements are probably not at the board level. These probably are at the management level with your executive team. If you're not on the executive team, this is something you could do within your department or within your area, and maybe lead up by helping the executives within your organization see kind of how it works at a field level or departmental level or a unit level, etc. But these statements are essentially outlining the parameters for the levels of risk related to the different resources that you are responsible for: people, assets, funding, etc. So under what circumstances are we willing to take a risk? What are some of the alignments between those risks and our outcomes? And how will we measure assessing those risks, right? So let's look at an example. So the top bullet is a template. So essentially I've got brackets there where you can add your own things, right? And then the second one is an example. And this first one is a general one that tends to apply to a global nonprofit that has field staff, right? And then next I'll show you one that's more innovation focused. But so this example, a hostage situation, so that's the risk, the safety of a staff member in transit in Colombia is a level 2 risk. And maybe we say it's level 2 because Colombia is way safer than it was, say, 10 years ago. And so overall, we've lowered the risk level from a 3 or a 4 down to a 2. And it's being taken in pursuit of our outcome, the desire to see every community have clean water. And that risk is constrained by our staff's compliance with security protocols. So we're managing that risk, or we're constraining that risk based on all the protocols we've already put in place about how they travel and when and where and all those things. And it's acceptable as long as there's no government restriction in that given area. So as long as the government, our metric for measuring risk is, has the government changed the security status of that area where they're going to travel? Okay? So that's an example of how you might write one of those statements. And you see the template, you fill in the risk, you fill in the tolerance scale, the outcome, the constrained by statement, and the metric. And that allows you to get a sense for what you're willing to do. And this isn't a ironclad statement that can't, that doesn't need nuance or exceptions, but it's a helpful process for you and your leaders to work through in writing out how you would make the decision for the level of risk you're willing to take. So now let's look at an example related to an innovation program. Okay, so let's say a new innovation, a new program that requires more than 25% of our undesignated annual revenue. That's a big chunk, right? For some organizations, that's bigger than others, but is a level 3 risk, so it's fairly high, and is being taken in pursuit of our desire to give women the opportunity to thrive through education. That's the cause, that's the outcome that this fake organization is trying to accomplish. And the risk is constrained by our ability to develop a robust business plan for the program, but is acceptable as long as there is a pathway to recover the investment in 5 years. Okay? So this is trying to walk that balance of stewardship yet trust, right? We're saying God, in this statement, we're saying we feel God really wants us to roll out this new program. It's going to take a significant amount of resources that we do not have designated funds yet for. We do not have donors giving to this thing yet. We are having to invest our own, it could be reserves, it could be undesignated just income into the organization, whatever it might be. But we feel it's important enough to do because God wants us to accomplish this, that we're willing to do it, even though it's at a level 3. But here's some of the things that we're going to put into place to be good stewards. We're going to say that it has to have a business plan, and we're going to say that we really want to see it replace that money back into the general fund within a certain amount of time. So that's an example of how you might write one of those statements. I'd like to, I'm going to answer this question that Dean asked right now. And then what I'd like you to do is type in questions you might have related to these kind of 3 tools I've given you around the matrix or the measurement tool, around the policy for the board, and then around these risk statements. Go ahead and type in any questions you would have. It's 10:50, so it's 10 minutes till the top of the hour, so we have about 5 or 6 minutes to take questions, and love to do that. Let me now answer Dean's question. We'll stay here so you can keep seeing that example. So he says, how might leaders best encourage a biblical posture of risk-taking innovation as they work to shape their organizational culture? And then associated with that question, how can a personal modeling by leaders intentionally be used to encourage biblical risk-taking in others? That's a great question, Dean. Thank you for asking that. I think the best way to model this is to actually apply it in situations. So the best way to show people that we are not being driven by fear and control, and that we are willing to take risks to accomplish our kingdom objective, is to dream big about what the kingdom objective is, to identify some innovative new things you want to do, and to walk through this process of acknowledging the risk, discerning through prayer what God wants you to do, and then taking the risk. But along the way, I think the key is to be very intentional about documenting that process and living it out transparently in front of the staff and your team and your board and your donors. Is to say, let's actually live that out in such a way where they see me doing it. The best way to, and that really ties into the second part of your question, Dean, because to do it personally in your leadership within your role is critical to modeling it and to allowing that to cascade down into the organization. The other thing, though, is to build some of these protocols into your organization. So a risk tolerance policy with the board will help you to have a much healthier interaction with the board about what is a theology of failure. Are board members wanting too much control? Are they being too risky? Is staff wanting too much control? Are they being too risky? Are we viewing it the way God views it? Right? So I think it's a mix between modeling it and putting some of these key structural things in place that when you model it, allow you to have something to fall back on so that when someone says, how did you ever do that? That was so brave, right? If you took a risk. Well, you can say, yeah, I felt it was brave too, but it wasn't because I had the strength. It was because God gave me the strength to do that thing. And I'm now able to do it because we put these things in place and we're trusting God for the outcomes based on good stewardship. So hopefully that is an encouragement there. And then Todd has a question. The evaluation of risk seems to center around our beliefs and values about stewardship. I would agree with that. Managers characteristically approach stewardship by seeking to conserve resources in order not to lose them, a scarcity mindset focused on the present with an eye to the future. While leaders characteristically see the need to risk resources in order to create something better, a growth mindset with an eye on the present and a focus on the future. That's a great observation. There's definitely, and I think that goes back to your profile, right? You're right that a leader is more focused on the future, so they are naturally more likely to be open to risk, right? Because they see the potential for reward. Whereas a manager somewhere in the organization that is already full up, they're busy, 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 they have too much going on, they feel like their job is to keep the status quo going so that they can keep on top of all the operational things that they're responsible for. So one of the things I think that we do need to talk about within our organizations is, what does godly and kingdom stewardship look like, right? If you're a manager managing an existing thing, what does stewardship look like? And what is your posture towards risk? If you're a leader, one of the things I've seen over and over again is leaders who, blue sky think, they come back from their retreat, they say, we're going to go off in this direction, and they run that way, and all the staff run with them. And then, a few months later, they go to a conference, they get a great new idea, they say, oh, let's run this way. And the staff has whiplash, and they run the other direction. And the CEO is taking tremendous risks with their staff's well-being, with the organization's resources, and they're not necessarily being good stewards, even though it looks to the donor or to a board member like they're on the cutting edge, but they may actually be being a very bad steward and not managing that risk tolerance well at all. All right, Greg says, tactically speaking, minimally viable products and iterations seem a little more nebulous and less defined than a typical business plan with performas and timelines usually allow. You have counsel on how to wisely handle that tension. Well, Greg, you bring up a great point. We live in a world driven by agile models, right? We're not driven by models where you say today is the start date and it'll be done in 3 months and everything is certain and it will go along the schedule perfectly and in 3 months it'll be done, right? Today, with so much uncertainty and so much complexity, we are iterating constantly on things. And I think that is where we have to, whatever the site in our iteration, risk management or risk assessment and stewardship should be a part of those discussions. So if you're familiar with Agile tends to be weekly, what they call Scrum meetings and cycles, essentially. They have weekly cycles where they work on the deliverables and they morph and change on what happens, and then evaluate and have the next cycle. So it's very iterative. Well, in that cycle, there should be some risk language that gets used to say, so did we manage and did we steward our risk well this week? Did we work with it well? Where did we expose ourselves to risk that maybe we didn't think we did because there was an uncertainty, we had to change our plan? Where have we reduced risk? Was that a good thing? Or were we trying to control things and maybe we need to be a little more risky? I think it's building it into the much more constant cycle. For some people it's daily, some people it's weekly, some people it's monthly. All right, Sarah has a question. She says, my experience is most often with risk-averse people, and this is what I don't understand. These people are willing to take risks to risk personal financial security, personal comfort in a new culture, and even personal risk to safety. And yet these same people freak out when anything changes in the organizational process. Why? Okay, this is a great question, Sarah. And working in mission types of organizations for many, many years, I've wrestled with this one a lot. And let me give you what I would say is my basic assessment. Okay, what we are unwilling to risk is what we put our identity in. Okay, so if my identity is in something, if I get my value from something, that is where risk tolerances tends to be lowest, because my identity is something that I want to preserve. For missionaries and staff that take great financial risk in raising their own support and moving to another country, and standing in long lines to pay bills and all these sorts of things, money is something they have already given up in their minds. They need it, of course, and sometimes they don't have enough of it, and it can be a constant worry. But fundamentally, the faith supported worker within the nonprofit sector has accepted a low level of financial reward, and has accepted the fact that finances will not be how they define their identity. So what is their identity defined them? Their identity tends to be switched when it's not in Christ, where it belongs, but none of us are perfect, so we don't always have our identity in Christ, right? So when it's not in money, it's switched to what they do or their position, their influence. So their identity is usually for a faith driven, so self-supported field worker. Their identity is either in the work that they are doing and how well they feel it is going, how well they're performing, or in the influence they have within the organization. So Sarah, you could see why people that were willing to take great financial risk are not willing to take risk when it comes to the quality of their work, the way the work is done, or their position of influence within the organization. So I have found that in that situation, we have to understand where people's identity is coming from when it's not where it should be in Christ, right? So on the best given day, the best faith worker will have their identity in Christ, and they will be making decisions out of that posture. But on a lot of days, that's not the case, because we're human and we're still working through what it means to belong to the King and to be living by his rules. And so in those cases, we have to understand where the identities come from. Is the identity coming from the work? So if the new innovation that you're working on is challenging how the work is done, you might get tremendous pushback. Or is it coming because that person is very influential within the organization, even though they may not have a positional role of influence? And the innovation that you're working on is actually challenging that person's influence. They push back significantly. I hope that helps a little bit. We need to wrap up. I want to be sensitive. It's the top of the hour, and I want to be sensitive to your time. So just remember where we're at in the process. We've talked about the engine, we've talked about the fuel, and we've talked about risk tolerance. Next, we're going to talk about best practices. And that's going to be very, very practical, just tools I've used over the years, tools that people have showed me, have shared with me, I've heard of or I've picked up along the way. And so it's just a time to fill your toolbox with some cool stuff to try. And that'll be happening on November 12th at 9 a.m. Feel free to join us for that. Again, the video will also be available. You'll be receiving an email from me probably on Monday, so in several days. It'll have the link to the video, as well as it will have several links to some resources for you to consider, as well as I will also send an invite to the next webinar. And I hope you'll join me for that. Let me wrap up our time in prayer, and then we will end this session. Heavenly Father, I want to pray that you would bless each of the people on this webinar, and even those who couldn't make it today. Help them to understand what you are doing in their lives, understand the innovations that you are calling them to champion on behalf of your kingdom. I want to pray that as they wrestle with risk and wrestle with stewardship and trusting in you and the fear and the control that are natural human responses, I pray that you would help them to come up with a godly and a balanced approach that honors you and points towards your kingdom, God. It won't look the same for any one of the people. It'll look different. but I pray that you give them great wisdom as they go about discerning what that looks like for them. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this webinar, and hope you have a great day ahead. Goodbye.